Well, one of the great myths of 1975 is that nobody talked about sovereignty, that people voted for a common market, they weren't voting on whether they should govern themselves or not. In fact, there's a much more vigorous debate about sovereignty and a much more sophisticated debate in 1975 than there has been so far in 2016. Because one of the big ideas of the 1970s is the idea of a crisis of government, a sense that Britain's ancient parliamentary institutions were starting to break apart, and that manifests itself in a rise in lawlessness, in the difficulty that the state has in imposing its will on trade unions, in concerns about Scottish and Welsh nationalism. And it comes together really in 1974 when a Prime Minister calls an election on the question of who governs Britain. So what that means is that this is a political culture that is used to talking about governability and that is already concerned about the danger to sovereignty of a political system that can't impose its will. Well, everybody talks about sovereignty. For the anti-marketeers, so those who wanted to get Britain out, sovereignty was the number one issue in their campaign. The right to rule ourselves is a slogan that you see all over their campaign literature. And for people like Tony Benn or Michael Foot or Enoch Powell, sovereignty was the number one question in the referendum. They might have disagreed on everything else, but the one thing they all agreed on was the sanctity of Parliament as the place where all these political struggles are fought out. Now, the pro-marketeers, the people who wanted Britain to stay in, also talk about sovereignty, but they do it in a slightly different way. So people like Ted Heath and Roy Jenkins argue that by pooling sovereignty, Britain can increase its power. It can have more influence over its own destiny and more influence over the wider world. And Ted Heath argued that sovereignty was like a currency. Sovereignty is something that you spend for purposes that you consider desirable. So we choose to spend some of our sovereignty by joining the European community, but as a result of that we get increased prosperity, we get increased security, and we get more control over our own destiny. I think the big difference is the one of context, the fact that the 1975 referendum is in many ways a crisis election. Right the way through the campaign, the strapline at the top of the Sun newspaper simply read "Crisis Britain." And that's partly a sense of economic crisis, a fear of economic collapse, but it's also this sense of a crisis of governability, a sense that Parliament could pass laws, but it could not impose them. It had passed the Industrial Relations Act, and it could not enforce it. It had tried to impose a settlement on the miners, and the government had fallen. So a sense of Britain's political institutions decaying to the point where they almost no longer functioned. So because of that, there's a reality to the debate about sovereignty, a sense of how do we protect our political institutions that I think has been missing today. But there's also a sophistication, because in 1975, the argument that you regain sovereignty simply by removing yourself from the European community simply doesn't wash. If you can't keep the lights on, if you can't maintain a stable power supply, then it's difficult to say that you're sovereign. So both sides are having to do more sophisticated things when they're talking about sovereignty. Sovereignty was a key part of the campaign for the people who ran the campaigns, for the activists. So for the anti-marketeers, it's the first item on almost all of their material. The pro-marketeers also talk about it a great deal. It doesn't seem to have been a key issue for the electorate. As far as we can tell from polling and from focus groups, the issues that the electorate really cared about were jobs, food prices, and the wider economy. So in that sense, the message that was being delivered to them about sovereignty didn't resonate. So one of the reasons why the Out campaign loses the referendum is that they fail to persuade the public that sovereignty is the key issue and that sovereignty is under threat from membership.